Why in the world would we not want Mary and Joseph as a guest for Christmas? You say, now, Pastor, I know you've been preaching this sermon series about folks you might not want to show up to your house at Christmas, and you understood about John the Baptist. He's a little bit crazy, a little kind of wild and willy, and maybe you don't want him over. And last week we talked a little bit about the angels and how they can be frightening, but this is Mary and Joseph. They're central to the Christmas story. I mean, they're right there in the middle of the manger. How would we have Christmas without Mary and Joseph? Well, Mary and Joseph were real people. And as we read in the scripture this morning, they were in a predicament. Joseph had found out that his wife was with child, and he did not know what to do with this, and he thought, well, I will just quietly divorce her. Who's going to believe this story about God and a Messiah? He's looking for a solution, but there is no real good solution to his problem. And in the midst of this, an angel comes and tells him that God is at work in a new and wonderful way. And Joseph made the choice to believe. Joseph made the choice to follow God's will, even though those around might not understand what is going on. And it puts Joseph and Mary on the edge of the society of that day. It puts them in this predicament. I mean, think about this. Joseph had a good name. Mary had a good name, and now it seems as if things are being whispered about them. We know that Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem because of the taxation, and they go there because it is their family's hometown. When you think about Joseph and Mary, I always wonder, where are the other relatives? I mean, all of the relatives, this is the hometown, they must be going to Bethlehem, but where are the parents? Where are the brothers and sisters? Where are the cousins? Where is everybody else? It's as if this couple has been deserted and left alone, and if I go to my hometown, I have all kinds of family I can stay with. Surely they had family in their hometown, and no one took them in. They had to find a barn to stay in. Not even grandmother and granddaddy. I was talking to a friend not too long ago, and I was talking to him about Christmas and who was coming home, and I said, well, is your son coming home? And he said, no. And I said, why not? He said, well, he's gotten his girlfriend pregnant, and he doesn't want to come home because he thinks I'll yell at him. And I said, well, would you yell at him? He said, yeah, I'd yell at him. He was right. Joseph and Mary were on the edge of what society would accept. I'm sure that they too had been yelled at a little bit, and so they undertake a trip by themselves. Mary, 9 months pregnant and riding on a donkey, how miserable that must have been. And then she gets there and gives birth in a barn. And we have these beautiful nativity scenes, and I love nativity scenes, but Mary always looks so angelic, as if she's just had a spa treatment. She gave birth in a barn. I don't think she would have looked quite as well as we probably have her. And then as soon as the birth takes place, we know that Herod begins to try to find Jesus to kill him. They are living on the edge. And we don't always like these kind of folks into our families and into our homes. But if we were to welcome those whom Jesus welcomed, those people who were always on the edge of society, where Jesus seemed to spend most of his time, we might learn something. You see, people who are on the edge give us an opportunity to be generous and to be gracious. When Mary and Joseph show up in Bethlehem, there is one gracious person in the story. We don't know his or her name. We just know that they were an innkeeper. Now, when I was growing up, no one wanted to be the innkeeper in the Christmas play. You know what the innkeeper does, don't you? They knock on the door, and you stick your head out the door and go, "No room, no room." And you slam the door in their face. That's what it looks like. I had a seminary professor that told us that when we preach about the innkeeper, we need to redeem this person. He didn't just say, no room, where everyone else said there's no place for this couple. This one innkeeper said, I don't have much of a place, but I've got this stable out back that you can use. At least it's warm and it's dry. Showed God's grace to this couple who is on the edge. Why do you get so many solicitations at Christmas for contributions? Because we know at Christmas time that people are generous, right? You're in a good mood, and so everybody comes and tries to get something from you. And those who are on the edge of society need our help. People who are on the edge give us an opportunity to be gracious and generous. Did you read that story that was in the paper this week about a couple, Owen and Carolyn Williams? They live in England, and they had a little baby, Katie. And when Katie was born, their neighbor, who was in his late 80s, a man named Ken, came over and fell in love with this little baby and just doted on this baby and gave this baby gifts. And when the baby was 2 years old, the neighbor passed away. They were all sad about this because it had become kind of an adopted granddaddy. The daughter of Ken came over to clean out the house, and she came over to William's house, and she had this big black plastic bag. And they came out, and they thought she was looking for a place to dump the trash out of the house. And she said, Dad wanted me to give this to you. And in that bag were 14 Christmas presents labeled for little Katie, one for each and every year. He had pre-bought, knowing that his life might come to the end, because he had seen this child and wanted to be generous. At Christmas time, certainly we too can be generous. Those who are on the edge offer us an opportunity to challenge and to stretch our preconceptions of life. Everybody assumed the worst about Mary and Joseph, but maybe, just maybe, when we assume the worst, God might be doing something different in the story of these other folks that we might condemn. God was at work in the life of Mary and Joseph, and very few people recognized it. A friend of mine, Courtney Allen, was minister of missions at First Baptist Church of Dalton in Georgia. And Courtney, she wanted to do something different with their mission. She wanted the church to get more involved with the folks that they were helping. They were doing a meal each and every week that they were feeding folks that were hungry. They just, on Thursday nights, gathered together and said, anybody who wants to come can come and eat this meal. It was going all right. They would have sometimes 25 or maybe 30, 35 people on a really good Thursday, and they would feed them the meal, and the folks would come, and they would eat, and then they would go. And Courtney said, why don't we try to invest in the lives of these people we are helping? Instead of just feeding them and watching them eat, what if we actually sat at the table with them and heard their stories and shared the love of Christ with them? Well, the folks on the missions team, they weren't all that excited about that. They're like, no, we just feed them. That's enough. And Courtney said, no, why don't we get to know them? Just try it for a month or two. And so they tried it, and they got some other families from the church to come and help host these tables. They began to get to know these families, and guess what happened? Some of these folks who are on the edge of society began to come into their church because they felt welcomed and loved, and that fellowship meal that had 25 or 35 people grew to have about 250 people. Not only those who were in need, but people in the church itself began to come and to share in the joys of being together and of hearing each other's stories. They invested into these other folks. They got past the preconceptions of who these folks were, and love broke out. You see, people on the edge can teach us new things. They can teach us to hope amidst difficulty. Sometimes I've talked to folks, and they have so many things going on in their life, you wonder, how do they not just give up? And yet there is a spark of hope. You see, hope and joy can be found even in adversity. How do you find joy? Well, you realize that joy and happiness are not the same things. Happiness is just kind of something that comes and goes. Joy is knowing that God is at work in your life and that God is present, and therefore you can rejoice because God is always about doing something good. When I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, I was pastor of Emory Baptist Church, and the house I lived in was owned by the church, and it was right next to the church, and we were on a major road, North Decatur Boulevard, and it was a road that had a lot of traffic on it, and a lot of folks came by the church. And it didn't take folks long to figure out that that house beside the church was where the pastor lived. What did that mean? That meant that I had folks knocking on my door day and night needing help. It could be overwhelming sometimes, and sometimes they were trying to scam us. But I remember one time I was out raking the yard, and a man named Jerome walked up to me, and he said, "Sir, could I help rake your yard? And maybe you could give me some food in exchange." And I thought, well, this could be a scam, but he's not asking for money. He's only asking for food. Somebody had warned me, don't let anybody do anything at your house because they'll fall down and get hurt and then they'll sue you. And I thought, well, maybe he's not doing that. Maybe he really just needs some help. And I said, all right. And so I got to talking to Jerome a little bit, and he helped me rake the yard, and I appreciated it, and my back appreciated it. And he said, can I come back next week? And I said, if you like, the leaves will fall again, and you can come back, and we'll talk some more and give you some more food. And this time we came back. He came back about lunchtime, and I thought, well, Christ would have me invite Jerome in and have lunch with us. And so I did. And as we sat around the table and as we got to know each other, we got time for the blessing. And Jerome said, can I say the prayer? And I'll never forget his prayer. It went something like this. He said, God, thank you for all the blessings of life. Thank you for the food that we are about to eat. And thank you that I did not get shot or stabbed today. Amen. And I kind of thought, is he doing that for show? Is he just trying to see my reaction? And I looked at him and looked in his eyes, and I could tell that he had prayed a very sincere prayer. And it dawned on me what kind of life that this man lived on the streets, and yet what kind of joy he had within his heart. And as I got to know Jerome more and more, I got to know his story, not only how he got on the streets, but his hopes and his dreams for life, and how he knew that something could get better, and we began to work together towards those ends. You see, we can learn from those who are on the edge. We can learn that even in the worst of hardships, that we can find the love of God. As a pastor, I see folks in all different kinds of circumstances, and I know that love is one of those things that cannot be taken away. I'll never forget my friend Paul Shinneman. Paul had been in a church for a long time, and I liked Paul because Paul was one of those guys that was always looking for something to do in the church, and Paul's favorite thing to do was to paint Sunday school classes. He'd come by about once a month, and he'd say, Pastor, is there a Sunday school class that needs to be painted? I've got some paint, I just got some time, and I just love to paint. All of the Sunday school classes got painted within a year. Paul was just that kind of guy. But Paul got sick. He was diagnosed with cancer. His wife, Helen, who loved him deeply, came and we all talked about it, and we were there for Paul as best we could. But I remember the last week of Paul's life going over for Forsyth Hospital to visit with him, and I walked in the room, and if I had not known who was in the bed, I would not have recognized him. And I looked above his bed, and there was a picture from our church directory of Paul in his suit, smiling, looking dapper. And below that picture was written, "This is who I am, Paul." And I asked Helen, his wife, I said, "Did you put that up?" She said, "Yes." She said, "These nurses are coming in and out, and all they see is a very sick man. But I know who Paul is, and I love him deeply, and I wanted them to see who he really is, not just who he is in these last days of his life." They were in a very difficult situation, but the love this couple had shone through deeply. And I've tried to remember that lesson, that when I see people, to see them with the eyes of love and to see them as God sees them. And people like Mary and Joseph, who are on the edge of society, need us to look with the eyes of God and say, what is really here? What might God be doing? Because people on the edge invite us to see things differently. They invite us to depend upon one another. Do you know that those who are in poverty give the highest percentage of their income to charity? They may not have great amounts to give away, but because they are on the edge and they see others on the edge, they tend to be the most generous people around. I heard a story one time about a man that died, and the pastor went over to see the young widow. He'd had a heart attack, and she was very distraught, and he came over to talk with her, and she looked up and said, "Pastor, I appreciate you coming, but I just don't want to talk to you." He understood. She was in grief. She was angry. And he said, though, "Is there someone else that you would talk to from the church?" And she said, "Yeah, Pastor, could you send over Joe?" Joe, he said. You see, Joe was a guy that came about 2 or 3 times a year. He sat on the back row. Joe was an alcoholic. He had problems. He fought them hard, but he was constantly overwhelmed by them. And he said, "Why would you want to see Joe?" And she looked back and said, "Because Joe understands what it is like to lose everything and to be on the edge of life and to still have to hope." People who are on the edge can teach us to depend on each other, to trust God more deeply. My friend Jason Williams is a young pastor. He doesn't pastor a church, he pastors a community. He and some friends of his, after graduating from seminary, went down to Charlotte, and they went down to Elderly Park, one of the poorest areas of Charlotte, and they rented an apartment, and they said, "What we are going to do is we are going to live here among some of the most distressed folks in this community. And we're going to be here, and we're going to share the love of God with anyone we can." The folks of the community looked at them and thought they were crazy. When he told me about it, I must have had something on my face that let him know that I thought he was crazy as well. Because he said, "Nelson, I can tell you think this is a harebrained idea, that this is something that we won't follow through on, but we're founding this house. We're calling it Hyatt's, which means welcome. Just like the Hyatt Hotel, but it's not the Hyatt Hotel." And then he told me a story. He said, "You think I'm crazy because I'm out living below what I could really live in. But let me tell you about Jimmy." He said, "Jimmy's a fellow that I met at Starbucks one day, and he said, I had on a t-shirt that said something about a Christian camp, and Jimmy came up to me and said, 'I'm a preacher.' And Jason looked at him and said, 'Where do you preach?' And he said, 'Anywhere they'll listen to me. I preach on the streets. I live under a bridge. But I just do whatever it is God would have me to do.'" He said, when Jimmy told me that story, I looked at him like you're looking at me, Nelson. Like, why in the world would you do that? Because Jimmy and Jason trust God. They trust God more than they trust all of the comforts of this world. Because they know that sometimes when you get out there and you live on the edge, you can love God more deeply and experience God more richly. You see, Mary and Joseph are folks that we might not have invited in. We might have been like everybody else in Bethlehem that night and said, we don't have room for you. Oh, of course, today when we think about Mary and Joseph and we see them in the beautiful manger scene and we tell their story, we tell it with such flair and such love that we put so much on it that it's almost unreal. But I tell you that the real Mary and Joseph are much better characters. You see, we can learn from them because folks who are on the edge have so much to teach us about life.